Page 78, Chapter 4, Postmodernism. What is postmodernism? What was modernism? Para. As with structuralism and post-structuralism, there is a great deal of debate about how exactly modernism and postmodernism differ. The two concepts are of different vintage, modernism being a long-standing category which is of crucial importance in the understanding of 20th century culture, whereas the term postmodernism, as is well known, has only become current since the 1980s. Modernism is the name given to the movement which dominated the arts and culture of the first half of the 20th century. Modernism was that earthquake in the arts which brought down much of the structure of pre-20th century practice in music, painting, literature, and architecture. One of the major epicenters of this earthquake seems to have been Vienna during the period of 1890 to 1910, but the effects were felt in France, Germany, Italy, and eventually even in Britain in art movements like Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Futurism. Its aftershocks are still being felt today, and many of the structures it toppled have never been rebuilt. Without an understanding of modernism, then, it is impossible to understand 20th century culture. Para. In all the arts touched by modernism, what had been the most fundamental elements of practice were challenged and rejected. Thus, melody and harmony were put aside in music, perspective and direct pictorial representation were abandoned in painting in favor of degrees of abstraction. In architecture, traditional forms and materials, parenthesis, pitched roofs, domes and columns, wood, stone and bricks, parenthesis closed, page 79, were rejected in favor of plain geometrical forms, often executed in new materials like plate glass and concrete. In literature, finally, there was a rejection of traditional realism, parenthesis, chronological plots, continuous narratives relayed by omniscient narrators, quote, close endings, etc., parenthesis closed, in favor of experimental forms of various kinds. Para. The period of high modernism was the 20 years from 1910 to 1930, and some of the literary high press within quote, of the movement, within parenthesis, writing in English, were T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Ezra Pound, Wyndham, W-Y-N-D-H-A-M, Lewis, Virginia Woolf, Wallace Stevens, and Gertrude Stein, and, within parenthesis, writing in French or German, Marcel Proust, Stéphane Mallarmé, André Gide, Franz Kafka, and Rainer Maria Rilke. Some of the important characteristics of the literary modernism practiced by these writers include the following. 1. A new emphasis on impressionism and subjectivity, that is, on how we see rather than what we see, parenthesis, a preoccupation evident in the use of the stream of consciousness technique, parenthesis close, stop. 2. A movement in novels away from the apparent objectivity provided by such features as omniscient external narration, fixed narrative points of view, and clear-cut moral positions. Stop. 3. A blurring of the distinctions between genres, G-N-R-E-S, so that novels tend to become more lyrical and poetic, for instance, and poems more documentary and prose-like. Stop. 4. A new liking for fragmented forms, discontinuous narrative, and random seeming collages of disparate materials. Stop. 5. A tendency towards reflexivity within quote, so that poems, plays, and novels raise issues concerning their own nature, status, and role. Stop. Para. The overall result of these shifts is to produce a literature which seems dedicated to experimentation and innovation. After its high point, modernism seemed to retreat considerably in the 1930s, partly, no doubt, because of the tensions generated in a decade of political and economic crisis, but a resurgence took place in the 1960s, a decade which has interesting points of similarity with the 1920s, when modernism was at its height. However, modernism never regained the preeminence it had enjoyed in the earlier period. Para. This gives us a rough indication of what and when modernism was. Does postmodernism then continue it or oppose it? To decide this, we need to attempt a working definition of this second term. Page 80. As a starting point, we can take a selection of the most readily available descriptions of postmodernism. J. A. Cudden's entry in his Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory describes postmodernism as characterized by, quote, an eclectic approach, comma, bracket, by a liking for, bracket closed, aleatory, aleatory, writing, comma, within bracket, and for, parody and pastiche, stop, unquote. So far, this does not really put much daylight between modernism and postmodernism, since the word eclectic suggests the use of the fragmented forms which, as we have just said, are characteristic of modernism. Parenthesis, Eliot's The Waste Land, for instance, is a collage of juxtaposed, incomplete stories or fragments of stories. Stop, parenthesis closed. Also, quote, aleatory forms, unquote, meaning those which incorporate an element of randomness or chance, were important to the Dadaists of 1917, who, for instance, made poems from sentences plucked randomly from newspapers. The use of parody and pastiche, finally, is clearly related to the abandonment of the divine pretensions of authorship implicit in the omniscient narratorial stance, and this too was a vital element in modernism. It could be said then that one way of establishing the distinction between modernism and postmodernism is to dissolve the sequential link between them by retrospectively redefining certain aspects of modernism as postmodernist. According to this view, they are not two successive stages in the history of the arts, but two opposed moods or attitudes differing as suggested in the next paragraph. Para. The nature of the distinction between modernism and postmodernism is summarized in the excellent joint entry on the two terms in Jeremy Hawthorne's HAWTHORN''S Concise Glossary of Contemporary Literary Theory, Edward Arnold, 1992. Both, he says, give great prominence to fragmentation as a feature of 20th century art and culture, but they do so in very different moods. The modernist features it in such a way, some printing mistakes are there, as to register a deep nostalgia for an earlier age when faith was full and authority intact. Ezra Pound, for instance, calls his major work, the Cantos, a rag-bag, R-A-G-B-A-G within quote, implying that this is all that is possible in the modern age, but also implying regret about that fact. In his poem, quote, Hugh Selwyn, Selwyn, Moberly, Mauberley, unquote, he speaks of the First World War being fought, quote, for 2 gross of broken statues, comma, / for a few thousand battered books, unquote, comma, and is evidently penned in lines from the same poem like, quote, a tawdry cheapness / shall outlast our days, unquote, and we see to Kalon, Kalon, within bracket, beauty / decreed in the marketplace by the rise of commercialism at the expense of eternal verities within quote. Page 81. In the Westland too, the Persona says, as if despairingly of the poem, quote, these fragments I have shored against my ruins, unquote. In instances like this, there is a tone of lament, pessimism and despair about the world which finds its appropriate representation in these fractured art forms, parenthesis, the collages of Kurt Schwitters, Kurt, Schwitters, for example, which mix painted areas of canvas with random clippings from newspapers, timetables, and advertisements, parenthesis closed. For the postmodernist, by contrast, fragmentation is an exhilarating, liberating phenomenon, symptomatic of our escape from the claustrophobic embrace of fixed systems of belief. In a word, the modernist laments fragmentation while the postmodernist celebrates it. A second and related difference between the two is also a matter of tone or attitude. An important aspect of modernism was a fierce asceticism which found the over-elaborate art forms of the 19th century deeply offensive and repulsive. This asceticism has one of its most characteristic and striking manifestations in the pronouncements of modernist architects such as Adolf Loos' LOOS' proclamation that, quote, decoration is a crime, unquote, or Mies van der Rohe, Rohe', Rohes, that less is more, within quote, comma, or Le Corbusier's that, quote, a house is a machine for living in, unquote. These pronouncements resulted in the, quote, shoebox, unquote, and, quote, carbuncle, unquote, buildings which generated such hatred and opposition, particularly through the 1980s, where the high idealism they represent retains its power to move. The same refined asceticism is seen in literature, in the minimalism which, for instance, shrinks poems to narrow columns of two-word lines registering rigorously sparse, pared-down observations, or in the drama of Samuel Beckett, in which a play may be reduced to a running time of 13 minutes with a single speaker, no set, and language which is sparse in the extreme. By contrast, again, postmodernism rejects the distinction between high and popular art, which was important in modernism, and believes in excess, in gaudiness, and in bad taste, mixtures of qualities. It disdains the modernist asceticism as elitist and cheerfully mixes in the same building bits and pieces from different architectural periods. A mock Georgian pediment here, a tongue-in-cheek classical portico there. A similar postmodernist edifice in literature would be the Martian, Martin, within quote, poetry of writers like Craig, Craig, Rain, Raine, or Christopher Reid, Reid, where bizarrely colorful mixtures of imagery, viewpoint, and vocabulary jostle on a surface which seems happy, page 82, to be nothing but surface without the depths of significance which a literary education trains us to seek out. Nothing could be further in spirit from that austere modernist asceticism. Section Landmarks in Postmodernism Habermas, Habermas, Lyotard, Lyotard, and Baudrillard, Baudrillard, para. A major moment in the history of postmodernism is the influential paper Modernity in an incomplete project delivered by the contemporary German theorist Jürgen Habermas in 1980. For Habermas, the modern period begins with the Enlightenment, that period of about 100 years from the mid-17th to the mid-18th century, when a new faith arose in the power of reason to improve human society. Such ideas are expressed or embodied in the philosophy of Kant in Germany, Voltaire and Diderot in France, and Locke and Hume in Britain. In Britain, the term, quote, the age of reason, unquote, was used till recently to designate the same period. The so-called Enlightenment project is the fostering of this belief that a break with tradition, blind habit, and slavish obedience to religious precepts and prohibitions, coupled with the application of reason and logic by the disinterested individual, can bring about a solution to the problems of society. This outlook is what Habermas means by modernity. The French Revolution can be seen as a first attempt to test this theory in practice. For Habermas, this faith in reason and the possibility of progress survived into the 20th century and even survives the catalogue of disasters which makes up the century's history. The cultural movement known as modernism subscribed to this project in the sense that it constituted a lament for a lost sense of purpose, a lost coherence, a lost system of values. For Habermas, the French post-structuralist thinkers of the 1970s such as Derrida and Foucault, Foucault, represented a specific repudiation of this kind of Enlightenment modernity. They attacked, in his view, the ideals of reason, clarity, truth, and progress, and as they were thereby detached from the quest for justice, he identified them as, quote, young conservatives, unquote, full stop, para. The term postmodernism was used in the 1930s, but its current sense and vogue can be said to have begun with Jean Foucault's Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, page 83, Manchester University Press, 1979. Lyotard's essay answering the question what is postmodernism, first published in 1982, added in 1984 as an appendix to the postmodern condition and included in Brucker's Modernism/Postmodernism, 1992, takes up this debate about the Enlightenment, mainly targeting Habermas in a slightly oblique manner. Lyotard opens with a move which effectively turns the debate into a struggle to demonstrate that one's opponents are the real conservatives, parenthesis, a familiar bottom line of polemical writing on culture, parenthesis closed. Quote, from every direction, unquote, he says, quote, we are being urged to put an end to experimentation, unquote, and after citing several other instances, he writes, within parentheses, obviously of Habermas, parenthesis closed, colon, indent begins. I have read a thinker of repute who defends modernity against those he calls the neoconservatives. Stop. Under the banner of postmodernism, the latter would like, he believes, to get rid of the uncompleted project of modernism, that of the Enlightenment. Stop. Indent closes. Brucker, P141, para. Habermas's is simply one voice in a chorus which is calling for an end to artistic experimentation and for order, unity, for identity, for security. Brucker, page 142. In a word, these voices want, quote, to liquidate the heritage of the avant-gardes, avant-gardes, unquote. Stop. For Lyotard, the Enlightenment whose project Habermas wishes to continue is simply one of the would-be authoritative, quote, overarching, unquote, quote, totalizing, unquote, explanations of things, dash, like Christianity, Marxism, or the myth of scientific progress. These meta-narratives, within brackets, super-narratives, which purport to explain and reassure, are really illusions fostered in order to smother difference, opposition, and plurality. Hence, Lyotard's famous definition of postmodernism, that it is simply, quote, incredulity towards meta-narratives, unquote. Quote, grand narratives of progress and human perfectibility then are no longer tenable, and the best we can hope for is a series of, quote, mini-narratives, unquote, which are provisional, contingent, temporary, and relative, and which provide a basis for the actions of specific groups in particular local circumstances. Postmodernity thus deconstructs the basic aim of the Enlightenment, that is, quote, the idea of a unitary end of history and of a subject, unquote, stop, para. Another major theorist of postmodernism is the contemporary French writer Jean Baudrillard, whose book Simulations 1981, translated 1983, marks his entry into this field. Baudrillard, page 84, is associated with what is usually known as, quote, the loss of the real, unquote, which is the view that in contemporary life the pervasive influence of images from film, TV, and advertising has led to a loss of the distinction between real and imagined, reality and illusion, surface and depth. The result is a culture of hyper-reality in which distinctions between real and imagined, page 84, Baudrillard is associated with what is usually known as, quote, the loss of the real, unquote, comma, which is the view that in contemporary life the pervasive influence of images from film, TV, and advertising has led to a loss of the distinction between real and imagined, comma, reality and illusion, surface and depth. The result is a culture of, quote, hyper-reality, unquote, in which distinctions between these are eroded. His propositions are worked out in his essay, Simulacra, Simulacra, and Simulations, unquote, reprinted in abridged form in Brooker, 1992. He begins by evoking a past era of fullness, fullness, when a sign was a surface indication of an underlying depth or reality. Parenthesis, quote, an outward sign of inward grace, unquote, comma, to cite the words of the Roman Catholic Catechism, parenthesis closed. But what, comma, he asks, comma, if a sign is not an index of an underlying reality, but merely of other signs, question mark. Then the whole system becomes what he calls a simulacrum, simulacrum. He then substitutes for representation the notion of simulation. The sign reaches its present stage of emptiness in a series of steps, which I'll try to illustrate by comparing them to different kinds of paintings. Para. Firstly, then, the sign represents a basic reality. Let's take as an example of this the representations of the industrial city of Salford, Salford, in the work of the 20th century British artist L.S. Lowry, Lowry. Mid-century life for working people in such a place was hard, and the paintings have an air of monotony and repetitiveness, cowed, cowed, comma, stick-like figures fill the streets, comma, colors are muted, comma, and the horizon filled with green factory-like buildings. As signs, then, Lowry's paintings seem to represent the basic reality of the place they depict. Para. The second stage for the sign is that it misrepresents or distorts the reality behind it. As an example of this, let's take the glamorized representations of cities like Liverpool and Hull in the paintings of the Victorian artist Atkinson Grimshaw. These paintings show the cities at night, wet pavements reflecting the bright lights of dockside shops, the moon emerging from behind clouds, and a forest of ships, ships, apostrophe, masts silhouetted against the sky. Life in these places at that time was presumably grim too, but the paintings offer a romantic and glamorized image, so the sign can be said to misrepresent what it shows. Para. The third stage for the sign is when the sign disguises the fact that there is no corresponding reality underneath. To illustrate this, take a device used in the work of the surrealist artist René Magritte, Rene MAGRITTE, page 85, where in the painting an easel with a painter's canvas on it is shown standing alongside a window. On the canvas in the painting is painted the exterior scene which we can see through the window. But what is shown beyond the window is not reality, against which the painting within the painting can be judged, but simply another sign, another depiction, which has no more authority or reality than the painting within the painting, parenthesis, which is actually a representation of a representation, parenthesis closed. Para. The fourth and last stage for the sign is that it bears no relation to any reality at all. As an illustration of this stage, we have simply to imagine a completely abstract painting, which is not representational at all, like one of the great purple mood canvases of Mark Rothko, R-O-T-H-K-O, for instance. I should emphasize that I am not suggesting that these four paintings are examples of the four stages of the sign, merely that the four stages can be thought of as analogous to the four different ways in which these paintings signify or represent things. Para. The first two of these stages are fairly clear, the second two perhaps less so. Baudrillard's own example of the third stage, when the sign hides an absence, is Disneyland. In one way, of course, it is a sign of the second type, a mythological misrepresentation of the United States. Indent begins. All its, bracket, the USA apostrophe S bracket closed, values are exalted here, comma, in miniature and comic strip form, stop. Embalmed and pacified, digest of the American way of life, comma, panegyric to American values, comma, idealized transposition of a contradictory reality. Indent closes. Brooker, Modernism/Postmodernism, page 154. Para. But Disneyland is actually a third-order simulation, a sign which conceals an absence. Indent opens. Disneyland is there to conceal the fact that it is the real country, comma, all of real America, comma, which is Disneyland, parenthesis, just as prisons are there, to conceal the fact that it is the social in its entirety, in its banal omnipresence, which is carceral, C-A-R-C-E-R-A-L, parenthesis closes, full stop. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real. Indent closes, para. In a word, Disneyland has the effect of, quote, concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, comma, and thus of saving the reality principle, unquote, stop. Within postmodernism, the distinction between what is real and what is simulated collapses. Page 86. Everything is a model or an image, all is surface without depth. This is the hyper-real, as Baudrillard calls it. Para. The grand sweep of this kind of rhetoric has a strong appeal. One might see it as a kind of latter-day Platonism, comma, its devotees enjoying the mystical insight that what is normally taken as a solid and real world is actually just a tissue of dreamlike images. If this second aspect of the postmodern condition, this loss of the real, is accepted as a fact, then it is hard to see a ground for literary theory to occupy, since all methods of literary interpretation Marxist, feminist, structuralist, and so on depend upon the making of a distinction between surface and depth, between what is seen, S-E-E-N, in the text and some underlying meaning. Once we accept that what we see is all we get, then there is clearly very little which a literary critic or theorist can claim to be doing. Para. More generally, for postmodernism, there are certain ever-present questions and provisos. In this extreme Baudrillardian form, the, quote, loss of the real, unquote, may seem to legitimize a callous indifference to suffering. In a low, notorious pronouncement, Baudrillard maintained that the Gulf War never happened, that what really took place was a kind of televisual virtual reality. Parenthesis, but see the discussion of this matter in chapter 14, parenthesis closed. Likewise, if we accept the loss of the real and the collapsing of reality and simulation into a kind of virtual reality, then what of the Holocaust? Could these two be part of the reality lost in the image networks? In other words, without a belief in some of the concepts which postmodernism undercuts, history, reality and truth for instance, we may well find ourselves in some pretty repulsive company. Section opens Stop and Think in a different font from the main text. The crucial category in Baudrillard's four-stage model is the third one, the sign which conceals an absence, which conceals the fact that the supposedly real which it represents is no longer there, that beyond the play of surfaces there is nothing else. Para. It is not easy to achieve a precise understanding of this concept. It may help in doing so if you try to think of examples other than Disneyland. The idealized images of masculinity or femininity presented in advertisements, for instance, may be, page 87, helpful. These also are copies or representations for which no original exists. No actual people are quite like these, though people might strive to become like them. In this way, the image tends to become the reality and the two tend to become indistinguishable. Para. Further, if we agree that the real has indeed been lost, then we need to decide how we react to this fact. If we are to revel in the boundary-free zone which results, we will need to be sure that the real is a concept we can do without. Perhaps recent events suggest otherwise. In the television coverage of the first Gulf War, we saw computer image film of high-tech smart weapons homing in on Iraqi targets, while the commentary spoke of surgical strikes which could take out key enemy installations. News bulletins also included footage of pilots who spoke of what they were doing in the same unreal terms, using the terminology of video combat games, for instance. Perhaps these things are symptomatic of what can happen when the category of the real is eroded. Likewise, could we condemn the Holocaust without the category of the real, or campaign against, say, racial discrimination or environmental pollution? Stop and Think section closes. New section. What postmodernist critics do. Original font size. 1. They discover postmodernist themes, tendencies and attitudes within literary works of the 20th century and explore their implications. 2. They foreground fiction which might be said to exemplify the notion of the disappearance of the real, in which shifting postmodern identities are seen. For example, in the mixing of literary genre, the thriller, the detective story, the myth saga, and the realist psychological novel, etc. 3. They foreground what might be called, quote, intertextual elements, unquote, in literature such as parody, pastiche, and illusion, in all of which there is a major degree of reference between one text and another, rather than between the text and a safely external reality. 4. They foreground irony in the sense described in Umberto Eco, Umberto Eco, ECO, that whereas the modernist tries to destroy the past, page 88, the postmodernist realizes that the past must be revisited, but with irony. IRONY. Modernism/Postmodernism, edited by Peter Brooker, page 227. 5. They foreground the element of narcissism, NARCISSISM, in narrative technique, that is, where novels focus on and debate their own ends and processes, and thereby, quote, denaturalize, unquote, their content. 6. They challenge the distinction between high and low culture and highlight texts which work as hybrid blends of the two. Section Postmodernist Criticism and Example, para. A useful example of postmodernist criticism which makes a straightforward application of ideas derived from Lyotard is Geoffrey Nealon's Nealon', quote, Samuel Beckett and the Postmodern, colon, Language Games, Play and Waiting for Godot, reprinted in the Macmillan New Case Book on Waiting for Godot and Endgame, edited by Stephen Corner, 1992. This mainly shows the first of the 6 postmodernist critical activities listed above, but also has elements of the second in the sense that the notion of language as a self-contained system relates closely to Lyotard's idea of the disappearance of the real. Nealon first explains the notion of, quote, language games derived from Wittgenstein, whereby when we claim that something is true, we are not measuring it against some external absolute standard, but by internal rules and criteria which operate only within the designated sphere and have no transcendent status beyond that. These have a restricted applicability just like the rules which govern moves in a game. Thus, knight, Knight, to king's rook 4 might be a winning move in a chess game but would carry no weight at all in a game of football. Say, or an argument about who should do the washing up. Likewise, the move in a philosophical discussion which establishes a proposition as true or valid has its validity only within the language game of philosophy. For Nealon, Vladimir and Estragon in Beckett's play Waiting for Godot engage in language games of this type, but without realizing their full significance. Actually, such language games, the postmodernists agree, are all we have. There is no transcendent reality behind them, and they are actually self-validating and provide us with the social identity we seek. But Vladimir and Estragon hanker for some deeper or transcendent reality over and above this. Thus, says Nealon, quote, it is the play of Vladimir and Estragon's words, comma, page 89, not any agreed upon meaning for them, which constitutes their social bond. Waiting for legitimation of their society in Godot is, from the beginning, unnecessary, stop, unquote, para. Vladimir and Estragon then have difficulty in accepting this postmodern view that gaming is enough. Just Gaming is the title of one of Lyotard's books. They wish to have the security provided by some grand narrative of guarantee and absolute validation. This desired comprehensive reassurance is linked in the play with Christian notions of redemption which recuperate, bracket, meaning roughly, explain and give significance to, bracket close, the apparently meaningless details and trials of daily life. Quote, offer it up, unquote, my Catholic teachers would say in response to any minor complaint about unfairness or injustice. Vladimir Estragon then are trapped at the modernist stage and hence riven with nostalgia for the lost wholeness of the past. For Nealon, the kind of legitimating discourse which Vladimir and Estragon seek is parodied in Lucky's Think near the end of the first act. This is a parody of the totalizing meta-discourse of philosophy and religion, a practical demonstration of the language game of truth, which is all that is available to us. It is, says Nealon, a narrative that disrupts and deconstructs all notions of universal, ahistorical, consistent meta-narrative, all Godots, Godots. Had Godot turned up, the implication is, what could he have offered but pious and pedantic gibberish of this kind? Para. Lucky has perceived this, hence his exuberant and joyous parody, but the others resist it, so his speech is met with violence. The modernist, that is, wishes to go on believing in the toppled gods and Godot's Vladimir and Estragon, for Neelan, are throughout the play on the verge of a deconstructive breakthrough, unquote. When they forget about Godot, they are happy and inventive in their language games, reveling, we might say, in the openness and uncertainties of the postmodernist condition. But repeatedly they come back to Godot and the supposed restraints and imperatives he places upon them. Quote, "Let's go far away from here," unquote, Vladimir proposes at one point, to which the response is, quote, "We can't, ... we have to come back tomorrow, ... to wait for Godot," unquote. We might characterize this view by saying that Vladimir and Estragon proved themselves in the end to have a modernist attitude to the fragmentation of truths and values which we have seen in the 20th century. They long for a return to the, page 90, lost fullness of purpose of the past, so their experience of fragmentation is nostalgic and angst-ridden. Stop. At times they seem on the verge of making a transition or breakthrough, as Neelan calls it, to a postmodern attitude in which fragmentation becomes a condition welcomed and enjoyed, but in the end they fail to do this. Para. The modernist/postmodernist dichotomy that underpins this reading could be applied to many other works. Are there any which stand out in your mind? Waiting, for instance, seems to be an important activity in 20th century drama, notably in the plays of Harold Pinter / The Dumb Waiter would be a very obvious example. You might like to consider the value or otherwise of using the ideas of postmodernism in the explication of any of his plays with which you are familiar. Another waiting play on which a very similar reading might be attempted is Anton Chekhov's The Three Sisters, 1901, in which the sisters of the title, Olga, Masha, and Irina, are stranded in lives of bourgeois respectability in northern Russia, 23 hours by train from the next town of any size. See Michael Friend's introduction to the Mithuen edition of Chekhov's plays. The sisters wait in vain, like Vladimir and Estragon, for some external force to enter their provincial lives and transform them, and the ideals for which each pines can be seen as personal meta-narratives, such as an ideal of social progress or the notion that their sufferings will in some way contribute to a better human life in the future. Irina, for instance, says near the end of the play that, quote, "A time will come when people will understand what it was all for, what the purpose was of all this suffering, and what was hidden from us will be hidden no more," stop, unquote. For the sisters too, the actually self-sufficient reality of their condition is provided by the language games they play endlessly, and the image of the capital city of Moscow, a glittering amalgam of memory and desire, which constitutes for them a kind of hyperreality or simulacrum. Section Selected Reading. Benjamin Andrew E.D., The Leotard Reader, Blackwell, 1989, a very useful source. Brooker Peter E.D., Modernism/Postmodernism, Longman, 1992, a general reader on the topic to examine alongside Doherty's and Waff's. I find the introduction makes heavy going of the modernism/postmodernism distinction, page 91, but this is a compact collection of the key items by Habermas, Leotard, Baudrillard, Jameson, Eco, Hutcheon, Hutcheon, etc., as well as earlier material. Conner Stephen, Postmodernist Culture, An Introduction to Theories of the Contemporary, Blackwell, 2nd edition, 1996. Conners has been an important voice in this field, stating issues and dilemmas with clarity and force. Docherty, Docherty, Thomas E.D., Postmodernism, a Reader, Columbia University Press, 1993. Monumental, The Rival Reader to WAUGHs, WAUGH', a very useful collection of material with subsections, each with its own introduction, but I prefer WAUGH for its overall clarity and convenience. Sarup Madden, An Introductory Guide to Post-Structuralism and Postmodernism, Longman, 2nd edition, 1993. A helpful section on postmodernism, including Lyotard and Baudrillard, and considerations of selected postmodernist cultural practices such as video and architecture. WAF, Patricia E.D., Postmodernism, a Reader, Arnold, 1992. A valuable collection of material which includes relevant American essays such as Susan Sontag's seminal quote Against Interpretation, unquote, which predate the general use of the term, quote, postmodern, unquote, as well as key pieces by Lyotard, Baudrillard, and Habermas. Also essays from the Marxist debate on postmodernism between Jameson and Eagleton, where postmodernism is reluctantly accepted as the inevitable cultural logic of late capitalism. Essays too from prominent theorists of postmodernism like Linda Hutcheon and Brian McHale, capital MC, capital H small A-L-E. Wood's Team, Beginning Postmodernism, Manchester University Press, 2nd edition, 2009. A comprehensive account of postmodernism presented in a lively and readable way. This is one of the titles in the Beginnings series. Page 92, Chapter 5, Psychoanalytic Criticism.